The silence wasn't actually silent. It was a high-pitched, crystalline ringing that vibrated in the marrow of my teeth. The auditory signature of a brain rattled inside a skull like a marble in a tin can. I blinked, and the world flickered in and out of existence like a failing CRT monitor. My head was pinned against the shattered plexiglass of the cockpit, and for a second, I wasn't a major in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. I was just a piece of meat caught in a metal trap. The cockpit of the MH-47 Chinook, my bird, the Vesper, was a graveyard of high-tech junk. Ray-traced embers from the avionics suite danced in the air, casting dancing, demonic shadows against the thick, oily smoke billowing from the turbine housing. The smell hit me then. Cutting through the haze of the concussion, a nauseating cocktail of JP-8 jet fuel, burned hydraulic fluid, and the copper tang of fresh blood. My blood. I tried to move, and a white-hot spike of agony shot up my left leg, screaming through my nervous system. I looked down. A piece of the airframe, jagged and scorched, had punched through the deck and pinned my flight suit to the seat, missing the femoral artery by what looked like a prayer. I reached for the survival knife on my chest rig, my fingers fumbling with the tactical nylon. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surge of a body that knew it was dying. I gripped the hilt, the serrated edge catching the flickering emergency lights, and hacked through the fabric. I wasn't just a pilot. I was a survivalist trained for the worst-case scenario. But the worst case didn't usually involve the entire city of Philadelphia turning into a meat grinder beneath my rotors. I checked my HUD. Dead. I checked the IFF transponder. Dark. We were off the grid, buried in the carcass of a skyscraper we'd clipped on the way down. Then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in a crash site. It wasn't the groaning of stressed metal or the hiss of extinguishing fires. It was a wet, rhythmic slapping. Thousands of footsteps. No, tens of thousands. It sounded like a tidal wave hitting a seawall, but the wave was made of bone and gristle. I dragged myself toward the cockpit door, my breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts that fogged my visor. I kicked the door open. And the sight that met me was an Unreal Engine nightmare brought to life in horrifying 8K resolution. The main cabin was a tomb. My crew, men I'd shared coffee with 4 hours ago, were tangled in their harnesses like broken marionettes. But they weren't still. Miller, my door gunner, was twitching. His neck was bent at a 90-degree angle, his spine snapped during the impact. But his fingers were clawing at the deck plates, tearing his fingernails off on the rivets. He looked up, and I saw it. The hunger. His eyes weren't human anymore. They were milky spheres of clouded cataracts, pulsing with a predatory light. He let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a wet, gargling hiss, the sound of air escaping a punctured lung. He lunged, held back only by the 5-point harness, his teeth snapping inches from my boots. I didn't hesitate. I drew my Sig Sauer M17, the weight of the polymer frame familiar and cold, and put a 9mm hollow point through his forehead. The muzzle flash illuminated the cabin for a microsecond, revealing the shadows of more things moving in the dark of the hold. I scrambled out of the wreckage, dropping 6 feet onto the cracked asphalt of an elevated parking garage. The air outside was worse. It tasted like decay and ash. I limped to the edge of the concrete barrier and looked down at the street level. My heart stopped. This wasn't an outbreak. It was an extinction event. The street was a river of gray, mottled flesh. A relentless ocean of the dead, packed shoulder to shoulder, stretching for miles into the urban haze. They weren't wandering. They were moving with a terrifying, singular purpose, a hive mind of hunger flowing toward the sound of my crash. The scale was incomprehensible. Thousands upon thousands of them, their collective moaning forming a low-frequency vibration that I could feel in my chest. Suddenly, the concrete beneath me shuddered. A massive, bloated shape was hauling itself up the side of the parking structure, It wasn't just a person, it was a mutation, a mass of fused limbs and distended muscle that looked like it had been rendered by a sadistic god. It breached the edge, its fingers, too many fingers, digging deep furrows into the rebar-reinforced concrete. I leveled my weapon, but as I did, the ground behind me erupted. The corpses, I thought, where debris from the crash began to stand. I was caught between a monster scaling the wall and a dozen reanimated horrors closing in from the wreck. I had 15 rounds in the mag, a busted leg, and 48 hours of hell ahead of me. I slammed a fresh magazine home, the metallic click echoing in the dead air. "Delta lead to any station," I whispered into the dead radio. My eyes locked on the approaching horde. "I'm on the ground. And God help me, I'm going to start killing every single one of them." The first bullet left the chamber with a crack that felt like a thunderclap in the oppressive, dead silence of the rooftop. It caught the bloated thing, this Goliath-class freak, square in what used to be its neck. The impact didn't stop it. Instead, the projectile vanished into a fold of necrotic, translucent fat, releasing a spray of pressurized, black ichor that hissed as it hit the hot, twisted metal of my downed bird. It didn't scream. It didn't have lungs for that anymore. It just let out a wet, rhythmic wheeze, like a bellows pumping air through a swamp. I adjusted my stance, my fractured tibia screaming in protest as I shifted my weight. I couldn't afford a tactical retreat. There was no way to go to. Behind me, the corpses of my crew and the VIPs we were supposed to extract were twitching, their spines snapping like dry kindling as they forced themselves upright, their eyes filmed over with that milky, predatory sheen. I transitioned to the nearest threat on my six, a former sergeant, someone I'd shared coffee with 4 hours ago. He was missing his lower jaw, his tongue lolling against his throat like a piece of raw liver. I didn't hesitate. You can't afford sentiment when the world has been rendered into a 4K nightmare of gore and teeth. I placed 2 rounds into his cranial vault. The kinetic energy did its work, his skull blossoming in a spray of gray matter and bone shards that looked hyperreal in the flickering orange glow of the burning turbine. 1 down. 11 to go on the roof. And then there was the thing on the ledge. The Goliath hauled its massive bulk over the concrete lip of the parking structure, the rebar groaning under its impossible weight. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, a mountain of fused muscle and distended limbs that looked like it had been stitched together by a god with a penchant for body horror. The skin was a mottled, bruised purple, stretched so thin over its ribcage that I could see things moving underneath, parasitic worms or perhaps just the churning of its own mutated organs. It raised a hand that was less a hand and more a cluster of 5 elongated, razor-sharp finger bones, and the air around it seemed to thicken with the stench of 1,000 open graves. I fired 3 rounds into its chest, aiming for the center of mass. The bullets hit with wet, heavy thuds, but the creature didn't even flinch. It began to lope toward me. A terrifyingly fast, asymmetric gait that defied its size. I dropped the empty mag, the metallic ting of it hitting the concrete cutting through the low-frequency vibration of the city's collective moan. I slammed the fresh one in, thumbed the slide release, and pivoted. I had to clear the smaller threats first. If they swarmed my legs, the big one would turn me into a red smear before I could blink. I moved with the mechanical precision of a man who had spent a decade training for the end of the world. Each shot was a calculated expenditure of resources. Double tap to the head of the flight medic. Single shot to the eye socket of the liaison officer. The recoil of the sidearm sent a familiar shudder up my arm, the smell of burnt cordite briefly masking the scent of rotting meat. But the scale of what was happening beneath me, down in the canyons of the city, was the real horror. I caught a glimpse over the edge as I maneuvered. The streets weren't streets anymore. They were rivers. An endless, undulating ocean of gray-skinned shapes, filling the avenues from building to building. There were hundreds of thousands of them, a hive mind of hunger moving in a singular, terrifying direction. From this height, they looked like an oil slick reflecting the neon lights of the skyscrapers, except the oil was made of teeth and reaching hands. The sound was the worst part. It wasn't just moaning. It was a rhythmic, guttural chant, a vibration that resonated in my very marrow, telling my lizard brain that the era of man was over and the era of the carrion had begun. The Goliath was on me. It swung a massive, mallet-like arm that caught me in the shoulder, throwing me 10 feet backward. I hit the side of my wrecked transport, the impact knocking the wind out of my lungs and sending stars dancing across my vision. My vision felt like a broken sensor feed, static, glitches, and white-hot pain. I looked up just in time to see the monster rearing back for a killing blow. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth that shouldn't have belonged to anything human. I didn't reach for my gun. I reached for the emergency flare tucked into my vest. I ripped the tab, the magnesium ignition blindingly bright in the twilight of the rooftop. I didn't throw it. I shoved the burning, hissing light directly into the Goliath's open maw. The creature recoiled, its entire head lighting up from the inside like a macabre jack-o'-lantern. It let out a sound then, a high-pitched, warbling shriek that shattered the nearby glass of the stairwell door. As it clawed at its own face, trying to dig out the chemical fire, I leveled my pistol at its throat, where the skin was thinnest, and emptied the remaining 12 rounds in a single desperate burst. The monster's neck disintegrated. Its massive head tipped backward, hanging by a few strands of scorched sinew, before the entire bulk of it collapsed like a felled oak. The rooftop shook. I slumped against the fuselage of the bird, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My shoulder was definitely dislocated, and the heat from the engine was starting to cook the air around me. But the silence didn't last. From the stairwell I heard it. A sound like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across pavement. They were coming up. They'd heard the dinner bell. And they were climbing the 20 flights of stairs with a tirelessness that no living thing could match. I looked at my gear. 1 mag left for the sidearm. My primary rifle was pinned under the main rotor assembly, crushed and useless. I had a combat knife, a half-empty canteen, and a radio that was currently spitting out nothing but the sound of someone screaming for their mother in a language I didn't recognize. I looked out at the horizon. The sun was dipping below the skyline, casting long, bloody shadows across the ruined city. The ray-traced beauty of the sunset was a cruel joke. In the dark, they would be faster. In the dark, I wouldn't be able to see the edges of the horde. I forced myself to stand, popping my shoulder back into its socket with a sickening crunch. That made me vomit bile. I needed to get off this roof. I needed to get to the street level, despite the ocean of dead waiting there. Because up here, I was just a trapped rat on a high-altitude pedestal. Down there, in the shadows, I might have a chance to disappear. I limped toward the stairwell door, the smell of the burning Goliath filling my nostrils, a sweet, cloying scent of roasted, rotten pork. As I reached the door, I saw something that stopped my heart. Scrawled in fresh blood on the metal surface of the door, in a handwriting that was jagged and desperate, were the words: "They are not eating us. They are changing us." I pushed the door open. The darkness of the stairwell swallowed me whole, and from the depths below, 1,000 voices began to whisper my name. Not in a language, but in a frequency that my soul understood. They weren't just hungry. They were waiting for me to join the choir. I stepped into the black, my tactical light cutting a weak, flickering path through the dust motes, knowing that every step down was a step closer to the maw of the world. The stairwell was a vertical tomb, a concrete throat that swallowed the beam of my surefire scout light. I moved with the practiced, predatory grace of a man who had spent a decade clearing compounds in the Hindu Kush, but this was different. My boots didn't just click on the concrete. They felt like they were sinking into something viscous. The air was thick, heavy with the copper tang of blood and a secondary, more offensive odor, the smell of a ruptured septic tank, mixed with the ozone of a dying electrical grid. Every floor I descended, the temperature rose. It wasn't the heat of a fire, but the humid, suffocating warmth of a living organism. My 416 Hong Kong dollars felt like a part of my own skeleton, the cold Picatinny rail biting into my palm, the only solid truth left in a world that was liquefying. I kept the muzzle low ready, my thumb riding the safety selector, my pulse a rhythmic hammer against my throat. The whispers didn't stop. They didn't come from the rooms beyond the heavy fire doors. They seemed to emanate from the very marrow of the building. It was a subsonic thrum, a collective vibration of 10,000 throats, humming a low, dissonant chord that made my teeth ache. I reached the landing for the 14th floor and froze. The door had been torn off its hinges, not by an explosion, but by brute, shearing force. The steel was curled back like a sardine can lid. I panned my light into the hallway and the ray-traced nightmare of the interior hit me with the force of a physical blow. The hallway was a cathedral of gore. The emergency lights were flickering in a chaotic strobe, casting long, jittering shadows that danced across walls coated in a layer of iridescent black slime. It wasn't just blood. It was a biological carpet, a network of fungal-looking veins that pulsed in sync with the humming I heard in my skull. I saw a pair of boots sticking out from an open doorway, standard-issue tactical gear. I sliced the pie, clearing the threshold with my muzzle lead, my eyes scanning for movement in the high-contrast gloom. It was a Delta operator. Or it had been. He was pinned to the wall by a protrusion of calcified bone that had grown out of his own ribcage, anchoring him to the drywall. He wasn't dead. His eyes, now clouded with a milky, pearlescent film, tracked my light. His jaw was gone, replaced by a cluster of shivering, translucent filaments that reached out toward me, tasting the air. This was the change the door had warned about. The virus wasn't just killing cells, it was rewriting the architecture of the human form, turning the body into a localized node for whatever hive mind was currently digesting the city. A wet, sliding sound came from the ceiling. I snapped my light up just as a shadow detached itself from the gloom. It wasn't a zombie. It was a reconfiguration, a human body folded backward, its limbs elongated and snapping with the sound of breaking dry wood as it skittered across the tiles like a centipede. I didn't think. I squeezed the trigger. 3 rounds of 5.56 NATO caught it in the center of its distorted mass, the muzzle flashes illuminating the hallway in blinding white bursts. The creature didn't scream. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a high-pressure valve, as it tumbled to the floor. It moved with a terrifying, fluid speed that defied physics. I backed away, my boots treading over the pulsating floor veins, and slammed the stairwell door shut, wedging my tactical tomahawk into the handle to lock it. My breathing was ragged, the sound of my own gasping lungs the only thing I could hear over the growing roar from below. I had to get down. I had to get to the lobby. If the upper floors were this compromised, the street level was going to be the heart of the storm. I descended the next 10 flights in a blur of tactical adrenaline, my knees screaming from the descent, my injured shoulder a white-hot coal of agony. By the time I reached the ground floor, the humming had become a physical weight, a pressure in my chest that felt like it was trying to stop my heart. I cracked the final door to the lobby, and the scale of the horror finally broke me. The lobby was a massive, glass-walled atrium, and beyond those windows lay the relentless ocean. It wasn't a crowd. It was a sea of gray, mottled flesh that stretched from one side of the boulevard to the other, packed so tightly that the individual bodies seemed to fuse into a single, heaving mass. They weren't wandering. They were swaying in unison to that subsonic frequency. A forest of dead wood caught in a psychic wind. The streetlights were dead, but the city was lit by the orange glow of 100 burning skyscrapers, the light reflecting off the slick, rain-drenched asphalt and the oily skin of the million-strong horde. In the center of the lobby, something was being built. A pillar of flesh, 30 feet high, composed of intertwined limbs and torsos, reaching toward the ceiling. It was a spire of the changed, a biological antenna made of screaming souls. I saw a movement near the security desk, a flash of digital camo. Another survivor. He was a ranger, his face a mask of dried blood, huddled behind a marble counter with a belt-fed M249 saw. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a 1,000-yard stare that told me he had seen the bottom of the abyss, and it had looked back. He didn't speak, he just pointed toward the glass doors. The horde outside had stopped swaying. 10,000 heads snapped toward the lobby simultaneously. The sound of their movement was like a tidal wave hitting a breakwater, a sudden, deafening roar of grinding bone and tearing fabric. They had smelled us. The ocean was no longer calm. It was crashing against the glass, the reinforced panes beginning to spiderweb under the weight of 1,000 bodies pressing forward, driven by a singular, hungry will. "Ready?" the ranger whispered, his voice a dry rasp. I checked my magazine, 12 rounds left. I transitioned to my sidearm, a Sig Sauer P320, the weight of it a cold comfort in my hand. "On your mark," I replied. My pilot's calm finally settling over me like a shroud. This was the cockpit of a crashing bird all over again. No room for fear, only for the next correction. The glass shattered. It didn't just break, it exploded inward under the sheer mass of the dead. A wall of rotted meat and grasping hands poured into the lobby, a literal wave of corruption that knocked over statues and tore the marble tiling from the floor. The ranger opened up, the saw chattering in long, rhythmic bursts that tore through the front rank of the horde, turning the first 10 feet into a soup of red mist and bone fragments. But for every one he dropped, 50 more stepped over the corpse. I began to fire, aiming for the nodes, the creatures that looked more changed than the others. The ones with the extra limbs and the glowing, bioluminescent veins. Each shot was a needle-thin line of order in a world of absolute chaos. We were being drowned. The lobby was filling up like a sinking ship, the gray tide rising toward us. I grabbed a thermobaric grenade from my vest, the pin cold against my finger. I knew that if I threw this, the lobby would become a vacuum, the heat turning us to ash along with them. But it was better than the spire. It was better than joining the choir. I looked at the ranger, and in the strobe light glare of his muzzle flash, I saw the black veins beginning to crawl up his neck. He was already changing. He knew it. He turned the saw toward the floor veins and screamed, a sound that was lost in the roar of the ocean. I reached for the pin, my world narrowing down to the 3 inches of steel between me and the end, when the ceiling above us disintegrated. A Black Hawk, my bird's sister ship, tilted dangerously low over the shattered atrium, its door guns spitting twin streams of tracers that carved a path of fire through the horde. The downdraft from the rotors cleared the smoke for a split second, revealing the true scale of the nightmare. The entire city was moving. Every alley, every subway tunnel, every skyscraper was vomiting forth the dead, a migration of the damned toward the center of the city. I grabbed the ranger by his vest, dragging him toward the extraction rope dropping from the sky, even as the first clawed hands of the ocean closed around my boots. The cable didn't just pull, it jerked with a mechanical violence that threatened to snap my humerus clean out of the socket. My boots left the blood-slicked marble of the lobby just as a dozen gray, necrotic hands clamped onto my laces, the weight of the dead trying to anchor me to the charnel house floor. I kicked wildly, the heavy ceramic toe of my flight boot shattering a jawbone, spraying black, pressurized ichor across my shins. The winch hummed, a high-pitched, straining whine that cut through the staccato roar of the M134 minigun overhead. Above me, the Black Hawk was a silhouette of jagged shadows and spitting ember flame, its downwash creating a hurricane of pulverized glass and powdered bone. The ranger I was clutching was a dead weight, his plate carrier slick with a mixture of hydraulic fluid and the thick, oily sludge leaking from his own neck. He wasn't just wounded, he was a biohazard in a tactical vest. The air grew colder as we ascended, leaving the stagnant, copper-scented heat of the lobby for the freezing slipstream of the rotors. My NVGs flared, the green phosphorus blooming into a blinding white as the door gunners poured 1,000-round bursts into the atrium below. It looked like a god-tier render of hell, a ray-traced nightmare where every muzzle flash illuminated a sea of reaching limbs, a literal carpet of the damned that stretched back into the darkness of the skyscraper's bowels. There were no individuals down there anymore, just a single, undulating organism made of teeth and rot. The scale was impossible. We were hovering over a hive that had consumed a metropolis in less than 48 hours. Then, the Ranger stirred. It wasn't the movement of a man regaining consciousness. It was the jerky, hydraulic twitching of a puppet with its strings being pulled by a maniac. His eyes, once a sharp, tactical blue, had dissolved into milky orbs shot through with obsidian filaments. He looked at me, and for a fraction of a second, I saw the man behind the mask, the fear of a soldier realizing he had become the enemy. His hand, shaking with the effort of a final, human volition, reached for his sidearm. He didn't point it at me. He pressed the muzzle of his Sig Sauer against his own chest, right beneath the edge of his ballistic plate. The muffled crack of the 9mm was lost in the turbine scream, but I felt the vibration through his vest. Blood, hot and strangely viscous, sprayed across my visor. He let go of my harness. I lunged for him, my fingers scraping against the cordura of his sleeve, but he was gone. He plummeted back into the dark, a falling star of spent life, disappearing into the ocean of the dead that waited with open maws 60 feet below. I didn't have time to scream. The winch slammed me into the cabin floor with a bone-jarring thud, and the crew chief dragged me inward, his face a mask of sweat-streaked grime and terror. "Pilot! Sit rep!" he screamed over the comms. But I couldn't speak. I crawled to the open door, my lungs burning with the thin, smoke-choked air. I looked out over the edge. The city didn't look like a city anymore. It looked like a circuit board that was short-circuiting. Fires were everywhere, but they weren't random. They were being choked out by the sheer mass of the dead. I saw a main thoroughfare, 8 lanes of highway. And it was entirely gray. Not the gray of asphalt, but the gray of millions of moving bodies. They were migrating. It was a tactical formation on a continental scale. They were flowing toward the outskirts, toward the evacuation zones, like a slow-motion tidal wave of meat. "Get us to the green zone!" I yelled, pulling my headset over my ears, the feedback squealing in my brain. "There is no green zone, sir!" the crew chief yelled back, his eyes wide. He pointed a gloved finger toward the horizon. "Look at the coast!" I leaned out, the wind whipping my flight suit. In the distance, where the naval blockade should have been, where the massive gray hulls of the Atlantic Fleet were supposed to be providing a wall of steel, there was only a pulsing, bioluminescent fog. The ships weren't firing. They were drifting. And on the surface of the water, illuminated by the dying glow of the city's power grid, I saw them. Tens of thousands of them. They weren't swimming, they were treading water, a floating bridge of corpses that stretched from the docks out toward the anchored destroyers. They were climbing the anchor chains. They were a swarm of locusts that had learned to conquer the sea. Suddenly, the Black Hawk bucked. A violent, metallic thwang echoed through the airframe, followed by the agonizing scream of the transmission. My stomach dropped into my throat as the bird began a sickening yaw to the left. "Bird strike?" I shouted, grabbing a handhold as the cabin tilted 45 degrees. "No!" The co-pilot's voice crackled, raw with disbelief. It's a wire. They've got a wire." I looked out the starboard door. From the roof of a nearby parking garage, a group of the infected, transformed into something bloated and monstrously strong, had hauled a downed high-voltage power line across the gap. They hadn't just accidentally caught us, they had waited They had timed the rotor's arc. The cable was wrapped around our tail rotor, dragging us down toward the concrete canyon. These weren't mindless zombies. This was predatory intelligence. This was an ambush. The pilot fought the controls, the cyclic vibrating so hard his hands were a blur. We were dropping fast, the altimeter spinning in a dizzying countdown toward zero. The buildings on either side of us became a blur of shattered windows and reaching shadows. I saw them in the offices, thousands of them, pressed against the glass, watching us fall like spectators at a coliseum. Impact brace! The world turned into a kaleidoscope of screaming metal and shattering plexiglass. We hit the roof of a department store, the skids snapping like dry twigs. The main rotor blade struck a mechanical penthouse, disintegrating into supersonic shrapnel that sliced through the cabin like a giant's buzzsaw. I felt the heat of the engine igniting. The smell of JP-8 fuel suddenly overwhelming the stench of decay. We tumbled, a $40 million coffin of magnesium and aluminum, rolling across the gravel-covered roof until we slammed into the parapet wall. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. I was hanging upside down in my harness, the world tilted at a nauseating angle. Outside the jagged hole where the door used to be, the sound began. It wasn't the roar of the horde anymore. It was a rhythmic, wet clicking. Thousands of vocal cords, ruined by necrosis, trying to mimic a signal. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in the ranger's blood, and where his blood touched my skin, the veins were already starting to pulse with the faint, obsidian light. I didn't have much time. I unbuckled. Falling onto the ceiling of the cabin, the shattered glass biting into my palms. I reached for my sidearm, but my holster was empty. I looked out into the smoky moonlight of the rooftop. They were already there, standing at the edge of the wreckage. They weren't rushing. They were waiting for someone, or something. And then, from the shadows of the stairwell door, stepped a figure. That made my heart stop. It wore the tattered remains of a general's uniform, its chest cavity open like a blooming flower, and in its hand, it held a tactical radio. The radio crackled. A voice came through, distorted but unmistakably human. Eagle 1, this is command. We have your coordinates. Tactical nuke is inbound. T-10 minutes. God have mercy on your souls. The general thing looked at the radio, then looked at me. It tilted its head, a mockery of curiosity, and then it spoke, not through its mouth, but through the radio in its hand, its voice a perfect, synthesized mimicry of the command operator. We heard. It whispered. We're ready. The obsidian light in my veins throbbed in sync with the pulsing red strobe of the helicopters. Emergency beacon, a rhythmic, sickening heartbeat that felt like it was trying to rewrite my DNA from the inside out. My vision smeared, the world rendered in a high contrast, hyper-saturated. Nightmare, think Unreal Engine 5.4 with the ray tracing turned up so high the shadows feel like they have weight. I stared at the thing that used to be a general. It didn't breathe. It didn't twitch. It just stood there in the ruin of its own ribcage, holding that radio like a holy relic. The air smelled of burnt JP-8 fuel, scorched aluminum, and a cloying, metallic sweetness that stuck to the back of my throat, the smell of a city-sized morgue baking under a summer moon. 10 minutes. 600 seconds until a tactical yield incinerated every mistake made in this godforsaken city. I didn't have my sidearm, but a Special Forces pilot is never truly unarmed. We are trained to turn the world into a weapon. I lunged, my hand closing around a jagged shard of the bird's shattered windscreen. The glass sliced into my palm, but I didn't feel the pain, only a cold, crystalline vibration where the obsidian veins met the open wound. The general thing didn't flinch. As I surged forward, two shadows detached themselves from the darkness of the HVAC units. They were fast, inhumanly fast, moving with a predatory fluidity that bypassed the jerky shambling of the common infected. They were dressed in tattered Tier 1 gear, their night vision goggles shattered over eyes that glowed with that same suffocating black light. I took the first one in the throat. With the glass shard. There was no blood, only a spray of thick, viscous ichor that hissed against the hot metal of the wreckage. I felt the impact vibrate through my marrow. It felt like hitting a wall of wet clay. The second one tackled me, the weight of its tactical vest slamming into my chest, pinning me against the burning fuselage. Its teeth snapped inches from my visor. A clattering sound like stones being ground together. I could see the individual pores on its gray, leathery skin, the way the infection had forced the bone to erupt through the cheeks in jagged spurs. I reached up, thumb gouging its eye sockets, feeling the wet pop and the crunch of the orbital bone. It didn't scream. It just pushed harder. Behind it, the general raised the radio again. 10 minutes is an eternity. The radio whispered in that perfect, stolen voice. Enough time for the hive to remember. Enough time for you to become the vessel. I bucked, throwing the dead operator off me, and scrambled for my survival kit lodged under the pilot's seat. My fingers brushed the grip of my flare gun. I didn't think. I aimed it at the general's open chest cavity and pulled the trigger. The magnesium flare erupted in a blinding, white-hot scream of light, burying itself in the mass of necrotized organs. The creature didn't burn like a man, it ignited like a chemical fire. It staggered back, the radio clattering to the concrete, and for a second, the collective psychic weight of the rooftop lifted. The two guards froze, their heads tilting in unison as if the signal had been jammed. I didn't wait to see the finish. I turned and sprinted for the ledge. The view from the top of the skyscraper was a panoramic descent into madness. Below me, the city didn't look like a city anymore. It looked like a living, breathing ocean of gray. The streets were gone, buried under a carpet of millions of bodies, all moving in a slow, rhythmic undulation toward the center of the blast zone. It was a tide of death, a biomass so dense that from 60 stories up, you couldn't see the asphalt. The sound drifted up to me, a low, subsonic thrumming, the collective groan of a million sets of rotted lungs, a sound that felt like it was trying to liquefy my organs. I checked my watch. T-8 minutes. The elevator shafts were a gamble I couldn't take. They'd be vertical coffins if the power flickered. I hit the fire escape door, kicking it off its hinges with a strength that terrified me. My legs felt light, my muscles overflowing with a toxic, electric energy. I was descending the stairs 5 at a time, my boots slamming against the metal grating, the sound echoing through the hollow core of the building like a gunshot. At the 50th floor, the door exploded inward. It wasn't a zombie. It was a mass of them, a clot. They had fused together in the narrow hallway, a mound of limbs and torsos jammed into the architectural artery of the building. They weren't trying to move, they were a barricade. I saw faces I recognized, members of the flight line crew, civilian contractors, all woven together by thick, obsidian filaments of that strange, fungal growth. Their eyes were open, staring at me with a singular, terrifying focus. "Step into the light, Eagle One," they said. It wasn't one voice. It was 1,000 voices, layered and synchronized, vibrating through the very walls of the stairwell. I pulled a thermobaric grenade from my vest, the big cough. I didn't have a choice. I primed it and shoved it into the center of the meat wall. I turned, diving back up the stairs as the hallway became a sun. The pressure waves slammed into my back, tossing me upward like a ragdoll. The heat was instantaneous, stripping the paint off the walls and searing the oxygen from the air. I tumbled, my vision blurring into a static-filled mess of red and black. I sat up, gasping, my lungs feeling like they were filled with crushed glass. My watch face was cracked, but the timer was still ticking. 6 minutes. The building groaned. The thermobaric blast had compromised the structural integrity of the upper landing. I looked down through the hole in the floor. Below me, in the executive suites, the darkness was shifting. The explosion hadn't just cleared the path, It had rung the dinner bell. I could hear them now, the scraping of nails on marble, the wet slap of bare feet on glass. They were coming up the walls. Not the stairs. The walls. I looked out a shattered window. Hundreds of them were scaling the exterior of the skyscraper, digging their fingers into the concrete, defying gravity with a single-mindedness that defied every law of biology. They looked like ants swarming a piece of fruit. The scale was impossible. The logistics of such an infection were a nightmare. How could a virus coordinate this? How could it calculate the structural weak points of a building to intercept a single survivor? I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I was a high-value asset in a war I didn't understand. I ran into the 48th floor executive lounge, my boots crunching on expensive crystal and bone. The obsidian pulse in my arm was getting louder, a literal sound in my ears now, a heavy, distorted bassline that seemed to sync with the ticking of the nuke. I saw a rack of security rifles behind a shattered display case. I smashed the glass, grabbing an 18mm Quatches with a suppressed barrel and a thermal optic. I slammed a mag in, the mechanical click the only thing that felt real in this Unreal Engine hellscape. I peered through the thermal scope. The hallway was a frozen blue. But then, the heat bloomed. Ghostly, flickering shapes of orange and white began to pour through the vents, under the doors, through the ceiling tiles. They weren't just the dead, they were the evolved. Some were elongated, their limbs stretched into multi-jointed scythes. Others were bloated, their skin translucent, revealing sacs of pressurized gas and bile. I opened fire. The suppressed pops of the 18mm Quatches were rhythmic and surgical. I moved in a low-ready stance, clearing corners with the muscle memory of 1,000 drills. Center mass. Headshot. Transition. The obsidian light in my eyes traced the flight of every bullet, showing me the internal geometries of the monsters before the lead even hit. I was moving too fast, seeing too much. I was a blur of tactical precision fueled by an alien catalyst. I reached the grand atrium, a 4-story open space with a glass floor overlooking the city. I stopped. Standing in the center of the glass floor was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 10. She was wearing a white dress, miraculously clean, and she was holding a teddy bear. But as I raised my rifle, the thermal scope didn't show orange or white. It showed a void. A hole in the heat of the world. She turned around. Her face was a perfect, porcelain mask, but where her eyes should have been, there were two swirling galaxies of obsidian light. "The flash is coming," she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from inside my own skull. "But the shadow remains. You have 4 minutes, pilot. Do you want to die as a man, or live as a god?" Outside, the sky began to bleed a pale, sickly yellow. The first of the interceptor jets were screaming overhead, their sonic booms shaking the skyscraper to its foundations. The countdown was reaching the terminal phase. Down in the streets, the ocean of the dead stopped moving. They all turned their heads upward, 1,000,000+ souls. Looking at the sky, waiting for the fire to take them. The girl reached out a hand. Her skin began to peel back like a ripe fruit, revealing a structure of black glass and pulsing light underneath. "The nuke isn't the end," she whispered. "It's the ignition." I looked at my watch. 3 minutes. My hand shook on the grip of the rifle. The obsidian veins in my arm were now glowing through my flight suit, a fierce, terminal black. I could feel the heat of the incoming missile, a distant, kinetic roar in the atmosphere. I looked at the girl, then at the sea of dead below, then at the sky. "I'm a pilot," I growled, my voice sounding like grinding tectonic plates. "And I don't take orders from the cargo." I leveled the rifle at the glass floor beneath her feet and emptied the magazine. The glass didn't just break, it detonated. Thousands of tempered shards, each one a jagged diamond reflecting the sickly yellow sky, transformed into a cloud of lethal shrapnel. As the structural integrity of the penthouse floor vanished, gravity claimed its prize. I wasn't just falling. I was entering a terminal ballistic trajectory through the guts of a dying world. The girl, the thing that looked like a girl, didn't scream. She drifted in the chaos of the descent, her skin shedding in wet, heavy ribbons of bioluminescent silk, revealing more of that impossible black glass skeleton. She looked less like a human and more like a piece of dark matter sculpted into a nightmare. I tucked my chin, pulling my limbs into a tight combat tuck to stabilize my pitch. The wind roared past my ears, a screaming banshee of ozone and the metallic tang of high-altitude smog. My flight suit, once a symbol of my rank and discipline, felt like a second skin of lead. Below me, the skyscraper's interior was a hollowed-out ribcage of steel and fire. I crashed through a suspended meeting table on the 80th floor, the mahogany splintering like matchsticks against my reinforced chest plate. The obsidian veins in my arm weren't just glowing now, they were vibrating, humming at a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision pulse with a violet hue. I could feel the kinetic energy of the fall being absorbed into my marrow, turning the lethal acceleration into a heavy, thrumming power. The girl reached out for me in midair, her elongated fingers snapping shut like a hydraulic press. I kicked off a falling concrete pillar, a maneuver born of 1,000 hours in the centrifuge, and used the momentum to roll mid-flight. I drew my secondary, a suppressed HKVP-9, and emptied the mag into her chest. The rounds didn't penetrate. They flattened against her translucent ribs with the sound of hammers hitting an anvil. She hissed, a sound that bypassed my ears and echoed directly in my prefrontal cortex, a psychic screech of pure, unadulterated hunger. Then, the world turned white. The first of the tactical nukes didn't hit the building, it airburst 3 miles over the city center. The flash was a total systemic collapse of reality. Even through my polarized flight visor, the light was a physical assault, a searing wall of photons that bleached the world of all color. For a heartbeat, I saw the skyscraper skeleton in X-ray, every bolt, every rebar, every panicked soul still hiding in the lower floors. The shockwave followed, a kinetic hammer of atmospheric pressure that caught us mid-fall. The building didn't just crumble, it atomized. The vacuum behind the shockwave yanked the air from my lungs, leaving me gasping in a void of heat and pulverized stone. I hit the ground, but it wasn't the ground. I slammed into the ocean of the dead. The street was packed so densely with the infected that they formed a literal liquid floor of heaving, rotting meat. My terminal velocity was cushioned by the simultaneous crushing of 1,000 ribcages. I went deep, sinking into a sea of cold skin, grasping hands, and snapping jaws. It was a sensory overload of the most horrific kind, the smell of 1,000,000 open graves, the wet, squelching sound of pressurized decay, the frantic, mindless movement of a species reduced to a single, ravenous instinct. I was drowning in the dead. I fought my way upward, my SF training taking over as I used my elbows and knees to breach the surface of the flesh tide. The sky was no longer yellow. It was a swirling vortex of radioactive ash and burning embers, a localized firestorm generated by the thermal pulse. The girl was standing 20 yards away, perched atop a mound of twitching corpses as if she were standing on a throne. She wasn't burning. The radiation seemed to be feeding her, the black glass of her skin drinking in the gamma rays, glowing with an intensity that made the surrounding air shimmer with Cherenkov radiation. "The ignition," she whispered, her voice cutting through the roar of the firestorm like a razor through silk. "Can you feel it, pilot? The atom is the ultimate key. It unlocks the cage of the flesh." I looked at my hands. The obsidian veins had breached the surface of my skin, forming jagged, crystalline ridges along my forearms. I wasn't just infected, I was being rebuilt. My tactical HUD was flickering, the electronics fried by the EMP, but I didn't need it. I could see the heat signatures of the undead through the smoke, glowing like dying coals in a hearth. I could hear the rhythmic thrum of the girl's heart, a rhythmic, tectonic grinding deep within. her chest. A secondary explosion, a gas main or a fuel depot, ripped through the street to my left, sending a plume of blue flame into the ash-choked sky. In the flickering light, I saw the scale of what we were facing. The nuke hadn't wiped them out. The ones at the epicenter were gone, vaporized into shadows on the pavement, but the millions in the outer rings, they were changing. Their skin was darkening, hardening into that same obsidian glass. Their movements, once jerky and mindless, became fluid and synchronized. The ocean of the dead began to spiral. They weren't just wandering, they were forming a massive, kinetic mandala around the girl. A million voices began to chant, a low-frequency vibration that shook the very ground. It wasn't a language, it was a code. A biological command being broadcasted into the atmosphere. I reached for my ruck, my fingers fumbling with the heavy-duty nylon. I still had the case. The cargo, from the transport. The reason we'd crashed in the first place. My mission profile was clear: retrieve or destroy. I looked at the girl, then at the pulsating, crystalline horror I was becoming. My SF instincts screamed at me to finish the mission, to detonate the remaining thermite charges and end this nightmare. But as the first of the changed, super-infected, turned their glowing, violet eyes toward me, I realized the nukes weren't a solution. They were an accelerant. The air began to scream again. Not from the wind, but from the arrival of the second wave. The heavy bombers. They were going to carpet bomb the entire grid with incendiaries, trying to burn away what the radiation had started. I had 90 seconds to find hard cover or become part of the ash. I looked at the girl. She smiled, and her jaw unhinged further than any humans ever could, revealing rows of black glass teeth. "The fire is coming, little pilot," she mocked, her body beginning to levitate as the local gravity started to fail. "Will you burn as a man, or will you fly with us?" I didn't answer. I drew my combat knife, the blade vibrating with the same violet energy as my veins. I didn't need a plane anymore. I could feel the kinetic potential of the entire city humming under my boots. I wasn't a pilot of an airframe anymore. I was a pilot of the apocalypse. I charged. Not away from the fire, but directly into the heart of the swarm. Every step shattered the pavement, my newly reinforced muscles propelling me with the force of a hydraulic ram. I cut through the first line of the glass-skinned dead like a hot wire through wax. This wasn't combat, it was a harvest. The blood of the infected wasn't red, it was a thick, black ichor that hissed as it hit the heated air. Just as I reached the base of the girl's throne of flesh, the sky opened up. A wall of napalm, a literal river of fire, began to descend from the clouds. The world turned into a furnace. I looked up, the reflection of the falling fire dancing in my violet eyes, and for the first time since the crash, I didn't feel fear. I felt hungry. The air didn't just heat up. It ionized. The atmospheric pressure dropped so sharply my eardrums screamed in protest, a wet, popping sound that was immediately drowned out by the roar of 1,000 suns descending from the heavens. The napalm didn't fall like rain, it fell like the heavy, liquid hand of a vengeful god, a viscous curtain of jellied gasoline that turned the midnight sky into a blinding, searing orange-white void. I watched the first wave of fire connect with the outer rim of the horde, and the sound was something I'll take to my grave, a collective, wet hiss as 5,000 glass-skinned monsters were flash-boiled in their own internal fluids. Their bodies didn't just burn, they detonated. The heat expanded the gases trapped in their necrotic lungs until they popped. Like overinflated lungs, spraying bone shrapnel and boiling black ichor into the swirling firestorm. I stood at the epicenter of a thermal cyclone. The violet light radiating from my skin formed a flickering, kinetic shield, a shimmering heat haze that warped the world like a defective GPU struggling to render a dying star. My lungs, once screaming for oxygen, now found a different kind of fuel. I breathed in the carbonized remains of the city, the scent of JP-8 fuel, roasted marrow, and ozone, and it felt like high-octane nectar. My heart wasn't beating, it was a turbine. Spinning at 100,000 RPMs, vibrating my ribcage until I could feel the resonance in my very teeth. The girl, the thing that looked like a girl, hovered 20 feet above the pavement. Her hair whipping in the updraft of the napalm strikes like a nest of black vipers. She looked down at me, and her face split open, not into a smile, but into a vertical maw of serrated obsidian. Teeth. I didn't wait for her to strike. I pushed off the ground, and the pavement didn't just crack, it vaporized. I moved at a velocity that should have liquefied my internal organs. I was a human-shaped kinetic penetrator, a sabot round fired from the barrel of the apocalypse. I breached the inner circle of her throne of flesh, a pulsing, mountain-sized mound of fused limbs, and weeping sores that the horde had built in the center of the intersection. The smell was a physical assault, a miasma of concentrated rot and surgical-grade antiseptic. As I tore through the mass of bodies, I felt the tactical weight of my gear, the heavy ceramic plates of my vest, the cold steel of my survival knife, the remaining weight of my sidearm. It all felt like an extension of my nervous system. I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I was the entire airframe, the engine, and the ordnance. I collided with the throne, and the impact sent a shockwave through the city block that shattered every remaining pane of glass for 3 miles. I was swimming in a sea of twitching, hungry meat. Hands reached out to grab me, fingers ending in translucent, razor-sharp claws that scraped against my violet aura with the sound of a fork on a chalkboard. I felt their hunger, a cold, hollow vacuum that wanted to swallow the universe, but my hunger was louder. It was a roar. I swung my blade, and it wasn't just steel cutting flesh. It was a rift in reality. Every arc of the knife left a trail of ultraviolet fire that cauterized the souls of the dead before their bodies could even hit the ground. Then, the ground beneath the throne gave way. We weren't on the street anymore. We had collapsed the structural integrity of the subway tunnels below. We fell through a darkness illuminated only by the cascading rivers of fire pouring down from the surface. We were plummeting into the bowels of the city, a 300-foot drop into the rusted, flooded veins of the metropolis. I hit a rusted subway car midair, my boots shearing through the reinforced steel roof like a hot knife through butter. The metal groaned, a deep, tectonic shriek that echoed through the lightless tunnels. I landed in knee-deep water that was blacker than oil and thicker than blood. Silence followed, a heavy, oppressive blanket that felt like it was trying to crush my skull. I stood up, the water hissing as it touched my glowing skin. Around me, the tunnels were alive. Not with the mindless shambling of the horde above, but with something older, something more calculated. I clicked on my tactical light, the beam cutting through the gloom like a laser. The walls weren't concrete anymore. They were covered in a pulsating, bioluminescent fungus that throbbed in time with the girl's heartbeat. It looked like a nervous system mapped out in neon slime, stretching miles into the dark. Then I saw them. Not the glass-skinned variants. These were different. They were pilots of the rot. 7-foot-tall monstrosities, their skin stretched tight over elongated, multi-jointed limbs, their faces replaced by clusters of compound eyes that glowed with a sickly, rhythmic amber light. They didn't moan. They chirped, a high-frequency, mechanical sound that made my nose start to bleed. There were hundreds of them, hanging from the ceiling like bats, their shadows stretching out in the Unreal Engine-style ray tracing of my tactical light, casting distorted, impossible shapes against the weeping walls. "Target acquisition," I whispered, my voice sounding like grinding gravel. I felt the HUD of my mind lock onto every single amber eye in the darkness. My tactical training kicked in, not the training of a man, but the instincts of a predator drone. I calculated the trajectory, the windage of the damp tunnel air, the density of the water. One of the pilots dropped, its movement a blur of impossible physics. It was on me in a millisecond, its claws buried in my shoulder plates. I felt the cold bite of its venom, a paralyzing agent that tried to shut down my nervous system. But the violet fire in my blood didn't just resist it, it consumed it. I grabbed the creature's head, my fingers sinking into its skull like it was wet clay, and I didn't just crush it. I willed the kinetic energy in my body to expand. The creature didn't die, it exploded into a cloud of fine gray mist. I looked up. The girl was standing at the end of the tunnel, silhouetted by the orange glow of the firestorm raging above the street-level grates. She wasn't mockery anymore. She was fear. For the first time, she saw what I was becoming. I wasn't a survivor. I wasn't a hero. I was a biological weapon that had evolved past its programming. "You're not a pilot," she hissed, her voice echoing through the tunnels like 1,000 dying radios. "You're the crash." I didn't give her a cinematic retort. I didn't have room for words in a mind full of targeting data and thermal signatures. I felt the city above us begin to tilt. The napalm had compromised the foundations of the skyscrapers. The world was coming down. Thousands of tons of steel, glass, and concrete were about to pancake into these tunnels. I had 10 seconds before the local reality became a tomb of compressed rubble. I began to run. Not toward the exit, but toward her. Every step I took sent a geyser of black water 30 feet into the air. The amber-eyed monstrosities screamed and threw themselves at me in a suicidal wave. A physical wall of limbs and teeth. I didn't slow down. I became a blur of violet light, a human drill bit boring through a mountain of meat. I could feel the G-force pulling at my skin, the friction of the air beginning to scorch my flight suit. 5 seconds. The ceiling began to crack. A massive slab of concrete, half a city bus still embedded in it, smashed down 50 feet ahead of me. I jumped, clearing the debris in a single, gravity-defying bound. 3 seconds. I reached her. I saw the terror in her obsidian eyes, the realization that whatever god she served hadn't prepared her for the sheer, stubborn violence of a human pilot who refused to stay grounded. I didn't use my knife. I reached out and grabbed her by the throat, the violet energy from my hand searing into her neck like a branding iron. "Ejecting," I growled. Then the world went white. The skyscraper above us finally surrendered to gravity, and 10 million pounds of civilization came down to claim the dark. But as the ceiling collapsed, I didn't feel the weight. I felt the lift. I felt the violet fire in my veins reach a critical mass, and for a brief, blinding moment, I wasn't in a tunnel. I was everywhere. I was the fire, the steel, and the hunger. And I was just getting started. The silence that followed the collapse was louder than the explosion. It was the sound of a city's heart finally stopping, a pressurized void where the screams of the dying were replaced by the tectonic groan of 100,000 tons of steel and glass settling into a mass grave. I was under it all. I should have been a red smear between 2 slabs of reinforced concrete, but the violet fire wouldn't let me die. It hummed in my marrow, a radioactive lullaby that turned my nervous system into a high-voltage grid. I could feel the weight of the skyscraper above me, a crushing physical pressure, yet I felt lighter than I ever had in the cockpit of an A-10. My vision wasn't just sight anymore. It was a thermal, wireframe overlay of the world. I saw the heat signatures of the trillion maggots churning in the dark above me. I saw the structural weak points in the debris. And I saw the obsidian-eyed thing still clutched in my hand. She wasn't dead. Her neck was a charred ruin where my fingers had sunk in, the flesh fused like slag titanium. But her eyes, those twin abysses, were wide, reflecting the violet pulse of my own transformation. She wasn't afraid. She was hungry. Even as the rubble threatened to pancake us, she tried to bite, her jaw unhinging with a wet, sickening crack that echoed in the tomb-like silence. I didn't give her the chance. I slammed her head back into the jagged edge of a severed I-beam, the sound ringing out like a funeral bell. I needed out. My internal clock was redlining. If I didn't reach the surface, the violet energy would consume the oxygen in my lungs before the zombies could finish the job. I began to move. It wasn't crawling, it was a violent, kinetic excavation. I used my free hand to punch through concrete as if it were wet drywall, the violet discharge from my knuckles liquefying the stone on contact. Every thrust upward was a tactical maneuver, a calculated burst of energy that sent tremors through the ruins. My flight suit was shredded, my skin a map of abrasions and glowing veins, but I felt no pain. I only felt the mission. 48 hours. That was the window. I had reached the end of the clock, and the extraction point, the roof of the central transport hub, was only 3 blocks away. But those 3 blocks weren't streets anymore. They were the belly of the beast. When I finally breached the surface, exploding out of a mound of pulverized marble, like a scorched god, the air hit me like a physical blow. It smelled of ozone, copper, and the sweet, cloying rot of a million unburied bodies. The sun was gone, replaced by a bruised, charcoal sky. But the city was illuminated by the fires of a civilization in its final, convulsive death throes. I looked down from the heap of rubble and my heart, for the first time in 2 days, faltered. It was a sea. A literal, undulating ocean of the dead. They weren't just roaming, they were packed so tightly from building to building that the asphalt was invisible. It was a carpet of gray flesh, twitching limbs, and gnashing teeth that stretched for miles in every direction. The sound was a low-frequency thrum, the collective breathing of a hive mind that had finally achieved critical mass. This wasn't an outbreak anymore. It was a new ecology. And I was the only thing in the zip code that still had a pulse. The entity in my hand let out a piercing, high-frequency shriek. A signal flare for the horde. In an instant the ocean turned. 100,000 heads snapped toward my position with synchronized precision. The sound of their collective roar was enough to shatter the remaining windows in the street. They didn't run, they surged. They piled on top of one another, forming ramps of living meat to reach my elevated position. I checked my sidearm, 1 mag left. My combat knife was chipped and dull. My primary weapon was the violet fire, and it was flickering, the G-force of the transformation finally taking its toll on my human frame. Negative on the surrender, I whispered, the words tasting like copper. I threw the obsidian-eyed bitch into the advancing wave, watching her disappear beneath a swarm of her own children. Then I ran. I didn't run like a man, I ran like a pilot on a low-altitude strafing run. I leaped from the rubble, my boots finding purchase on the heads and shoulders of the damned. Every step was a wet crunch, a tactical calculation of weight distribution and momentum. I was a human stone skipping across a lake of corpses. The zombies tried to grab my ankles, their fingernails tearing at my boots. But I was too fast. I was a blur of violet light and desperate intent. A block away from the transport hub, the horde changed tactics. A group of the larger, bloated variants, the ones that looked like they'd been sewn together in a nightmare, slammed into the base of a standing parking garage, bringing the structure down across my path. The collapse was timed with predatory intelligence. I skidded to a halt, the violet energy in my legs screaming as I braked against the friction of 1,000 grasping hands. They swarmed me. A dozen of them at once, a mountain of cold, wet muscle and teeth. I was buried. I felt teeth sink into my shoulder, through the Kevlar of my flight suit. I felt hands clawing at my eyes. The darkness started to close in, the violet glow dimming as the weight of the dead pressed the air from my chest. This was it. The 48-hour mark. The final descent. But then I remembered the cockpit. I remembered the feeling of the stick in my hand, the roar of the engines, the absolute refusal to accept a stall. I wasn't just a survivor. I was Special Forces. I was a pilot. And a pilot doesn't die on the ground. I let out a scream that tore my throat raw, and I didn't just push, I detonated. I released every remaining drop of the violet fire in a single, radial burst. The shockwave turned the immediate circle of zombies into a mist of red vapor and bone shards. The pressure wave cleared a 50-foot radius, the heat cauterizing the bite on my shoulder and melting the asphalt beneath my feet. I didn't wait for the smoke to clear. I sprinted for the transport hub, my vision tunneling, my heart hammering a rhythm that felt like it was trying to break my ribs. I reached the base of the hub's external elevator shaft. The power was dead, the glass shattered. I grabbed the guide rail and began to climb, my muscles tearing, my fingers bleeding. Behind me, the ocean of dead was closing the gap, a tidal wave of rot, climbing over the piles of their own vaporized kin. I reached the roof just as the first light of a new, gray dawn began to bleed over the horizon. The helipad was empty. I stood there, swaying, the violet light in my veins fading to a dull, throbbing ache. My breath came in ragged, wet gasps. I looked out over the city, at the endless, undulating carpet of the dead that now owned the world. I was alone. A ghost in a graveyard. Then I heard it. A rhythmic, heavy thumping. Not the sound of a heart, but the sound of blades. Twin engine. Heavy lift. An MH-47 Chinook materialized out of the smoke, its black hull ghosting over the ruins like a predatory bird. Its searchlights cut through the gloom, settling on me, a lone, blood-soaked figure standing in the center of a dead world. The side door slid open, and I saw the silhouettes of men in full tactical gear, their weapons leveled at the horizon. A rope ladder dropped. I didn't wait. I lunged for it, my hands gripping the rungs with the last of my strength. As the Chinook began its steep, combat climb, I looked down one last time. The roof of the transport hub was already covered in gray. They were reaching for me. Millions of hands clawing at the sky, a forest of bone and rot. I pulled myself into the bay of the helicopter. A medic rushed forward, but I pushed him back. I crawled to the edge of the ramp, looking back at the burning remains of the city. My 48 hours were over. I had survived the crash, the outbreak, and the god thing in the dark. I was a pilot again. I was off the ground. But as I looked at my hands, the violet light wasn't entirely gone. It was settled deep under my skin, a permanent, pulsing reminder of what I had become to survive. I closed my eyes. The roar of the Chinook's engines finally drowning out the screams of the city. The mission was over. But as the sun rose over a world that no longer belonged to the living, I knew that the real war, the one for the soul of what was left of humanity, had only just begun. And I was the only weapon they had left.